They had the thought, fully formed, sitting right there, and then someone else said a version of it. The room nodded, and they said nothing. Not because they didn't know, because in the half-second before speaking, there was something that felt like a physical barrier. Something that calculated the risk faster than thought could intercept it, and decided, not yet, not now, not safe. They left the meeting with the idea unexpressed and the familiar aftertaste of self-betrayal that has been accumulating for years. Threat-based inhibition produced by social threat processing, specifically status, and certainty threat activating the brain's threat detection circuitry. In a freeze response misread as shyness, layered with self-handicapping. Silence is protective. If you never speak, you never get visibly wrong, and your competence remains permanently untestable. You knew the answer. You've been sitting with this for the whole commute home, replaying it. You had the thought before anyone else in that room. You had it fully formed. You could feel it ready. And then someone else said it. A less complete version. And the table nodded and moved on. And you sat there and said nothing. And the worst part isn't that they got credit for your idea. The worst part is the specific feeling in the half-second before you didn't speak. Something that happens faster than a decision, faster than thought can get involved. A calculation you didn't consciously run that came back with, not this time. Not safe enough. Wait, you've been calling it shyness for years. Or introversion. Or not being quick enough. Or not being confident enough. Or needing to have things more perfectly formed before you open your mouth. You've read the articles. You've tried the advice. Speak up more. Have your point ready before the meeting starts. Sit at the table, literally, so you're visible. You do all of this. And then the half-second comes and the same result happens. And you leave carrying the same weight. Because the problem isn't what you've been told it is. It's not a confidence problem. It's not a preparation problem. It's not even really a speaking problem. It's a threat problem. And until you understand precisely what your nervous system has decided is dangerous about that room, the articles are going to keep not working. The half-second that stops you isn't a decision. It's a verdict issued before your conscious mind even got to vote. In 2008, a neuroscientist named David Rock published a framework for understanding what makes human beings feel safe or threatened in social environments. He called it the scarf model. What he found, drawing on decades of threat response research, is that the social brain monitors 5 specific domains for danger. Status, your perceived rank relative to others in the room. Certainty, your ability to predict what happens next. Autonomy, your sense of control over what happens to you. Relatedness, whether the people around you register as ally or threat. Fairness, whether the terms you're operating under feel equitable. When any of those 5 are threatened, the brain activates the same circuitry it uses to detect a physical predator. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for language, for forming and delivering complex thoughts, gets partially offline, as blood and attention flood toward faster, older systems, the ones whose job is survival, not articulation. This is not a metaphor. It is a measurable neurological event. And in most meeting rooms, for the person who struggles to speak, at least 2 of the 5 are in constant low-grade threat. Status, if I say this wrong, how does it land? If I'm corrected publicly, what does that cost me here? Uncertainty, I cannot fully predict how this will be received, and unpredictable rooms are, to the threat detection system, dangerous rooms. So the half-second isn't timidity. It isn't a character failing. It is your threat detection system doing its job, issuing a risk assessment so fast you experience it as a war rather than a calculation. Here's the metaphor that makes this concrete. A smoke alarm cannot distinguish between a house fire and burnt toast. It doesn't care about context. It was built to respond to a signal, not to interrogate the signal source. When the signal arrives, it fires, and no amount of telling the smoke alarm that you were only making breakfast will stop it from firing next time. Because it doesn't process reassurance. It processes signal. Your threat detection system fires in meeting rooms the same way. Not because the room is dangerous. Because something in the room matches a signal the system was taught to treat as dangerous. Long before this job. Long before this organization. Long before you had a reason to be in a conference room at all. Which is what makes the next section necessary. Because if this is a learned threat response, the question isn't how do I get more confident? The question is, what, specifically, did this system learn to be afraid of, and where did it learn it? A smoke alarm cannot distinguish between a house fire and burnt toast. Your threat detection system is not asking whether the room is actually dangerous. It's asking whether the room resembles somewhere that once was. Think about a room where you were young, not necessarily a meeting room where you said something and it went wrong. Not catastrophically, Just, you spoke, and the response was correction, or laughter you did expect, or a silence that felt like judgment, or a look that communicated that wasn't quite right. It could have been a classroom, a dinner table, a family argument where you got the register slightly off, and suddenly the atmosphere changed. It could have been something that to an outside observer looked entirely minor. The threat detection system doesn't rank events by adult significance. It ranks them by emotional intensity and early proximity. A moment of public correction at age 9 can leave a deeper template than a professional setback at 32. Because it happened earlier, when the system was being calibrated, when the rules about what was safe to say in rooms with authority was still being written. And here's what self-handicapping is. This is the second psychological layer underneath the silence, and it's the one that tends to get missed. In 1978, two social psychologists named Stephen Berglers and Edward Jones ran a series of experiments on what happens when people believe their competence is under threat. What they found is that people will, under those conditions, reliably create obstacles to their own performance. Not out of self-destruction, out of self-protection. If you perform badly and there's a handicap in place, the failure is explained by the handicap. Your competence itself remains untested and therefore intact. Silence in meetings is a self-handicap. If you don't speak, you cannot be wrong in public. You cannot be corrected. You cannot watch someone's face shift as your idea lands flat, triggering the same sequence of sensations that the original template wired in. Speaking is where you get hurt. The competent stays preserved in theory, perfectly capable, just unexpressed, waiting for a safer moment that never quite arrives. What the silence is protecting is not your reputation in the room. It's something more fundamental. The possibility that you might be exactly as capable as you privately believe yourself to be. Because if you never test it publicly, that belief stays safe. The moment you speak and get a mixed response, which is what happens to everyone who speaks frequently, the belief has to survive contact with reality. And some part of you, trained early that public speech is where the damage comes from, has decided that the belief is worth more than the test. Here is what that costs. Not just professionally, though it costs there too. It costs you the experience of finding out that your competence can survive a bad idea, that you can be wrong in a room and remain whole, that the connection between public error and permanent diminishment. The rule that was written early was a rule for a room you are no longer in. Silence in meetings is a self-handicap. If you don't speak, you cannot be wrong in public, and your competence stays perfectly intact, perfectly untested, perfectly safe, and perfectly invisible. Confidence training doesn't work on this, and you already know that because you've tried it. Telling the smoke alarm there's no fire doesn't stop it firing. Telling yourself to be bolder, to just say the thing, to have your point ready. These are all instructions delivered after the half second has already run, which means they arrive too late. The verdict has been issued. The window has closed. What works is upstream of the half second, slower, less dramatic, and I want to be honest with you about this, not quick, but it is precise. Here's the one thing. The threat detection system updates through repeated exposure that ends safely. Not through intention, not through pep talks, through accumulated evidence, gathered one low-stakes instance at a time. That speaking in this specific room does not produce the outcome the system is predicting. The intervention is not speak more. That is the surface instruction, and the threat system ignores it. The intervention is find the lowest stakes possible moment in your next meeting, and say one thing that does not need to be brilliant. Not your best idea, not the thing that shows your range. Ask a clarifying question. Confirm something that was just said. Offer a specific detail that supports a direction already underway. One sentence, chosen for safety, not for impressiveness. What you are doing is not performing confidence. You are submitting a small piece of disconfirming evidence to a system that has been building its case on outdated data. You are showing the smoke alarm. This room, this specific speaking moment, did not produce the thing it is predicting. And nothing about you is different after it. The floor held. The atmosphere didn't change. This feels insufficient because the cultural script around speaking up is always about the brave, decisive moment. The idea that gets the room's attention. The question no one else asked. The contribution that changes how people see you. And maybe that moment comes eventually. But you can't get there from silence in one jump. The nervous system doesn't take leaps. It takes steps, very small ones, each of which produces a safe landing before the next one begins. One low-stakes sentence. Next meeting. Not to change how they see you. To change the evidence the alarm is running on. The self-handicap, the protection of the untested self, only relaxes when the test begins to feel survivable. And survivable doesn't come from deciding to be brave. It comes from surviving repeatedly, in small ways, until the prediction updates. The nervous system doesn't take leaps. It takes small steps, each of which has to land safely before the next one becomes possible. The next meeting is coming. The same table, roughly the same faces, the same dynamics you've been navigating. And somewhere in that meeting, the half second will come again, the thought will be ready, the window will open, the calculation will run. You know now what the calculation is actually calculating. Not whether your idea is good, not whether you are prepared, whether the room resembles somewhere that once hurt you, whether the risk of being heard is higher than the risk of staying silent. That calculation was not wrong when it was written. The room it was written for, the one with the correction, the unexpected laughter, the changed atmosphere. That room had different rules, different stakes, different consequences for getting it wrong. The system that learned to stay silent in that room was protecting you from something real. This room has different rules. You may not fully believe that yet, because the alarm fires before belief has a chance to intervene. But the evidence is available if you start collecting it. One sentence at a time, one meeting at a time. One small, unspectacular contribution that ends and leaves you intact. What I want to leave you with isn't a strategy. It's a question, the kind that doesn't resolve quickly, that surfaces in the quiet moments, that asks something of you over time. What have you been protecting by staying silent? And is the thing you're protecting still as fragile as it was when you first decided it needed to be kept safe? The you that learned to go quiet in rooms with authority was making an intelligent call with the information available. The question is whether you've updated the information, whether the protection is still proportionate to the risk, whether the self you've been keeping safe from the room is ready, finally, to find out what the room actually holds.